October 1986, on a forgotten spit of riverland outside Darien, Georgia, Corinne Ashby had exactly $1 invested in 50 acres nobody else in McIntosh County would touch. For 3 mornings in a row, she'd watched the same 4 hogs walk to the exact same bend in the reeds and stop. Not feeding, not fighting, but simply standing at the edge of the water as though something on the other side had drawn a line they refused to cross. On the 4th morning, she decided to follow them. Wading waist-deep through the marsh with her binoculars raised, she pushed farther into the reeds until she reached the exact spot where the animals always stopped. That's when she froze. It wasn't because the hog in front of her was unusually large. It was because of its color. She had just 45 days before the county sent in a professional crew to wipe out every hog on the property, and whatever she'd just discovered, she was running out of time to prove it mattered. As you watch, pay attention to exactly what Corinne notices about these hogs that no hunter, farmer, or county official had questioned for 60 years, because that single observation becomes the reason this forgotten marsh is remembered at all. The land had spent 11 years on McIntosh County's delinquent tax rolls. 50 acres of reed-choked marsh had been cut off from the mainland in 1926, when a dredged shipping channel transformed what had once been a peninsula into an isolated stretch of river bottom connected only by a narrow land bridge that disappeared beneath high tide. Over the decades, people stopped seeing it as land with possibilities and started seeing it as a place better left alone. The county listed the opening bid at just $1, expecting another empty auction and another unwanted property to remain on its books. Instead, Corinne quietly raised her hand. She was the only bidder. Outside the courthouse, several local farmers glanced at the auction sheet before one of them laughed. $1. Another smiled. She didn't buy land. She bought 50 acres of mosquitoes and wild hogs. A third folded the paper and shook his head. Give her 6 months. It'll be back at auction. Corinne simply folded the auction receipt, climbed into her truck, and drove away without saying a word. Most people saw 50 worthless acres. Corinne saw a question that had refused to leave her alone for 4 years. She had spent the previous 11 years trapping nuisance wildlife along Georgia's coast. Raccoons, snakes, beavers, and feral hogs had paid her bills for more than a decade, and by the time most jobs were finished, they disappeared from memory almost as quickly as they began. One never did. For years earlier, she had been called to remove a hog from neighboring farmland across the channel. While examining the animal, she noticed something she'd never seen anywhere else along the Georgia coast. Its coloring was different, not once, but every single time another hog came from that same isolated marsh. Curious, she mentioned it to a retired county surveyor over coffee one afternoon. He shrugged, stirred his coffee, and casually remarked that the marsh had been cut off from the mainland since 1926. Nobody's really walked through there properly since. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but Corinne thought about it for the next 4 years. When the auction notice finally appeared in the local newspaper, $1 seemed like a small price to finally answer a question she had never managed to forget. Standing knee-deep in the marsh that 4th morning, she found herself thinking about that same conversation again. If everyone believed the land was worthless, why had the hogs remained exactly the same for 60 years? She didn't know the answer. Not yet. But with only 45 days before the county's cull, she intended to find it before every piece of evidence disappeared forever. The first person Corinne spoke to was Ray Pruitt, a trapper who had spent more than 20 years removing feral hogs from marshes all along Georgia's coast. He listened patiently as she described the unusual coloring, the isolated marsh, and the way the same animal stopped at the exact same place every morning before slowly shaking his head. "Corinne, I've trapped hogs from here to Brunswick," he said. "They're smart, they're destructive, and they're all the same in the end. Whatever you think you found out there, it's still just another feral hog." Corinne thanked him for his time, but his certainty only deepened the question she couldn't shake. If a man with 2 decades of experience had spent his life trapping hogs across the Georgia coast, how had he never stopped to ask why every animal on that isolated marsh looked so remarkably alike? Her next stop was the county wildlife office, where the answer was even less encouraging. The wildlife officer barely glanced at her photographs before sliding a folder across the desk. For formal damage complaints had already been filed by neighboring farms, And after the latest incident, the county had approved a professional cull. Buying the land doesn't change anything, he explained. Feral hogs are still classified as nuisance animals under state policy. Unless someone proves there's something else, the removal goes ahead. The deadline suddenly felt much closer than it had only a few days earlier. If the county wasn't willing to wait, Corinne needed someone whose opinion carried more weight than official paperwork. Hoping science might succeed where bureaucracy had failed, she carried her photographs to the county extension office. The livestock specialist studied each image carefully before sliding them back across the desk. "Color doesn't prove bloodlines," he said. "Every feral population around here is mixed. Escaped farm stock, hunting releases, whatever found its way into the woods over the years. I'd spend more time preparing for the cull than chasing a theory." By the end of the week, Corinne had spoken to 3 different experts, and each had given her a different reason to walk away. One trusted experience, another trusted policy, the third trusted science. None of them believed the marsh was hiding anything worth saving. The hardest conversation came a few days later. Denise Holloway farmed soybeans directly across the channel, and that summer the hogs had destroyed enough of her crop to make every acre count. Standing beside rows of torn-up plants, she looked Corinne squarely in the eye. "I don't care whether they're rare," Denise said quietly. "I care that they're eating the crop that pays my mortgage. If those hogs matter so much, save them somewhere that isn't destroying my family's living." Corinne couldn't argue with her because Denise wasn't speaking out of anger or stubbornness. She was trying to protect her family's future in exactly the same way Corinne was trying to protect something she still couldn't fully explain. If you've ever had everyone around you tell you your idea couldn't possibly work, then you already know how Corinne felt. Stay with this one, because what she discovers over the next few weeks changes far more than anyone imagined. And if forgotten American stories like this are your kind of history, we'd love to have you with us. Only one person refused to dismiss her. Otis Freeman had spent most of his life fishing those waters. When Corinne asked whether he'd ever noticed anything unusual about the marsh hogs, he remained silent for so long that she wondered if he had heard the question at all. Finally, he looked across the reeds and spoke almost to himself. "I've watched those hogs since I was a boy. My daddy watched them before me, and they've always looked exactly like that." He lifted his binoculars again and quietly returned to watching the marsh. It wasn't scientific proof, and Corinne knew it wouldn't stop the county's cull. But it confirmed one thing she had begun to suspect. Someone else had noticed the same mystery long before she arrived. The challenge now was proving it before the county erased the evidence forever. With no funding, no research team, and no official support, Corinne did the only thing she knew how to do well. She watched. Over the next 2 weeks, she placed 9 trail cameras across the marsh, returning every few days to replace batteries, collect memory cards, and record every detail she could find. Instead of seeing one anonymous group of hogs, she gradually began recognizing individuals by their coat patterns, tusks, scars, and hoof prints, carefully assigning each one a place in a weathered logbook she carried everywhere. The work was slow, exhausting, and often frustrating. One camera disappeared after a large boar rubbed against the tree where it had been mounted. Another filled with water during a hard rain, destroying several days of photographs, while a third simply vanished, leaving Corinne to wonder whether someone crossing the flooded land bridge had taken it. Every missing camera meant missing evidence, and every missing photograph meant another piece of the story she might never recover. Even so, she kept returning to the marsh before sunrise, convinced the answer was still out there if she was patient enough to see it. By the end of the second week, the remaining cameras had documented 63 individual hogs spread across 9 distinct family groups. More remarkable than the number was their consistency. Every animal carried the same reddish-black coloring, the same unusually long snout, and the same narrow, straight tusks. None resembled the mixed feral hogs Corinne had trapped across the mainland for more than a decade. As the days passed, she stopped seeing random animals moving through the reeds. She recognized the old sow that always appeared first each morning, the young boars that never strayed far from one another, and the scarred male that seemed to patrol the same stretch of marsh every evening. They weren't behaving like unrelated feral hogs. They looked like a population that had lived together for generations. The more Corinne documented, the harder it became to believe she was looking at coincidence. For the first time, She felt she might have enough evidence to convince someone to take a closer look. Then everything changed. A king tide carried one of the hogs across the flooded land bridge onto Denise Halloway's farm, where it startled a horse badly enough to throw its rider. Denise suffered a broken wrist, and within hours the county declared the situation an emergency. The original 45-day deadline disappeared overnight as officials authorized an immediate cull. 14 days remained. Standing at the edge of the marsh, Corinne watched the same family groups move quietly through the reeds, completely unaware that someone else had already decided they had less than 2 weeks left to live. Every plan she had made, every calculation she'd worked around, and every hope of proving what she believed she'd found had been built around a deadline that no longer existed. Suddenly, time had become the one thing she no longer had. For the first time since buying the property, Corinne genuinely considered walking away. She had photographs, weeks of field notes, and enough observations to fill an entire logbook, yet none of it carried the authority needed to stop an officially approved cull. Standing at the edge of the marsh that evening, she realized something she hadn't noticed happening. Somewhere during those long mornings and quiet evenings, the hogs had stopped being anonymous animals. She knew which old sow always led the family groups into the reeds at sunrise, which young boars wandered together, and which scarred male never strayed far from the water's edge. She even knew where most of them would be when the county trucks arrived. If the cull went ahead, they wouldn't simply disappear from her notebook. They would disappear forever. For nearly a month she had been trying to prove they were worth saving, but with barely 2 weeks remaining, she found herself wondering whether everyone else had been right from the beginning. Perhaps some discoveries were simply made too late. As she turned toward her truck, another pickup rolled slowly onto the flooded land bridge. Otis Freeman climbed out, closed the door behind him, and walked over without saying a word. After a long moment, he reached into his shirt pocket and handed Corinne an old business card, its edges softened from years of being carried around. "Ever heard of the Livestock Conservancy?" he asked. Corinne shook her head. "About 15 years ago, I met a fellow who spent his life tracking old livestock bloodlines," Otis said, nodding toward the card. "If anybody knows what you're looking at, it'll be him. Call him tonight." That was all he said. Back home, Corinne placed the call. Dr. Aaron Weir, a livestock genetics researcher, listened carefully as she described the isolated marsh, the family groups she'd documented, the unusual coat patterns, and the fact that the land had been separated from the mainland since 1926. He interrupted only to ask an occasional question, and by the time nearly 20 minutes had passed, Corinne wasn't sure whether she had convinced him or simply exhausted his patience. Finally, he broke the silence. "Send me blood and tissue samples overnight." After a brief pause, he added quietly, "If what you're describing is accurate, this stopped being a hog problem a long time ago." The first laboratory results arrived 3 days later, and although they didn't identify the hogs, they ruled out almost everything Dr. Weir had expected to find. There was no evidence of modern commercial breeding and no sign of recent crossbreeding with mainland populations, indicating that whatever had survived inside that marsh had remained genetically isolated for an exceptionally long time. Instead of answering Corinne's question, however, the report created an even larger one. If these animals weren't descended from modern feral hogs, what exactly had they descended from? Determined to find the answer, Dr. Weir began gathering every historical record he could locate. Old aerial photographs showed the marsh before the shipping channel had been dredged in 1926, while county agricultural surveys from the late 1930s described a small population of what local officials simply called marsh hogs, believed to descend from Spanish livestock introduced into the southeast generations earlier. When the shipping channel was completed in 1926, the marsh became physically separated from the mainland, and while the hogs remained where they had always been, nearly everything around them gradually changed. Roads, development, and commercial farming connected most of the southeast's remaining wild hog populations with modern livestock, slowly erasing their original bloodlines through generations of crossbreeding. This marsh never reconnected, and the very isolation everyone believed had ruined the land had quietly protected something no one realized was still there. 3 days before the county's scheduled cull, the final genetic report arrived. Dr. Weir read through the analysis several times before looking up at Corinne and telling her that she had uncovered something extraordinary. The genetic markers matched the Choctaw hog, one of America's rarest surviving heritage swine breeds, descended from Spanish colonial livestock and now considered critically endangered. Instead of protecting an ordinary population of feral hogs, Corinne's forgotten 50 acres had been sheltering one of the rarest livestock bloodlines left anywhere in North America. For a brief moment, both of them believed the mystery had finally been solved, but Dr. Weir continued studying the aerial photographs spread across the table. After several minutes, he asked Corinne how certain she was that they had only been counting the animals living on her 50 acres. She admitted she wasn't certain at all, and Dr. Weir quietly slid another survey map across the table before explaining that they had likely been studying only one corner of a much larger isolated marsh system. Her property wasn't the discovery. It was the doorway to it. The dredging project completed in 1926 had separated nearly 900 acres of interconnected wetlands from the mainland, and Corinne's land occupied only a small section along its edge. That winter, Dr. Weir organized a much larger survey using additional trail cameras, aerial photography, and weeks of field observations across the entire marsh system. As the results came in, the numbers continued climbing well beyond anything either of them had expected. Every new survey revealed additional family groups moving through reeds and shallow water that few people had entered in decades, and every new count suggested the isolated population was far larger than anyone had imagined. When the final report was completed, the full marsh system was estimated to support more than 240 Choctaw hogs, making it the largest documented population of the breed known anywhere in the United States. The forgotten marsh that people had dismissed for 60 years hadn't been hiding worthless land at all. It had quietly preserved more of one of America's rarest heritage livestock bloodlines than every other known population combined, simply because everyone else had stopped looking. News of the discovery spread quickly through McIntosh County, and before long the people who had once dismissed Corinne's idea began returning to the marsh for entirely different reasons. Ray Pruitt was among the first. When he walked onto the property again a few weeks later, he wasn't carrying traps or setting bait. Instead, he spent the morning following Corinne through the reeds, studying coat patterns, family groups, and the differences she'd learned to recognize over weeks of careful observation. Before leaving, he smiled and asked, "Mind teaching an old trapper how to tell them apart?" Corinne simply nodded. Neither of them felt the need to revisit the conversation they'd had on his first visit. The county's emergency cull came far closer to happening than either of them liked to remember. The Livestock Conservancy needed time to review the laboratory findings, and with the county crew scheduled to arrive within 72 hours, Corinne spent 2 anxious days wondering whether the official paperwork would arrive before the trucks did. It finally came with just 1 day to spare. The cull order was formally withdrawn after the marsh was recognized as a protected heritage breeding population, and the same wildlife officer who had once told Corinne that buying the land changed nothing personally delivered the paperwork. This time, instead of explaining why the county couldn't help, he thanked her for refusing to give up. The county extension specialist also returned, this time carrying the genetic report he had once doubted would ever exist. After reading through the findings, he admitted that Corinne's field observations had documented details no one else had taken the time to record, and asked whether her notebooks could become the foundation for a regional heritage livestock survey. The same records he had dismissed as little more than an interesting theory had become valuable scientific evidence. Denise Halloway still had a farm to protect, and discovering that the hogs were rare didn't erase the damage they could cause if left unmanaged. Using one of the first conservation grants awarded after the discovery, Corinne helped install secure fencing along the flooded land bridge and worked with Denise to create a long-term management plan that protected both the soybean fields and the isolated breeding population. Denise never became sentimental about the hogs, but she no longer saw them as a problem that had to disappear. Instead, she came to see them as something that could be protected responsibly without sacrificing the livelihoods of the people living beside them. Sometime later, Corinne returned to the old dock where Otis Freeman was sitting with his binoculars, just as he had been the day they first spoke. She thanked him for the worn business card that had changed everything. Otis smiled quietly before looking back across the marsh. "I was just hoping somebody would ask the right question before there was nobody left who remembered the answer." Corinne followed his gaze across the reeds, where the same family groups moved quietly through the shallow water as they always had. The difference was that, for the first time in 60 years, people weren't watching them as pests waiting to be removed. They were watching them as a piece of American history that had finally been recognized before it was too late. For 60 years, everyone who looked at that marsh asked the same question. How do we get rid of what's living out there? Hunters saw nuisance animals. Farmers saw damaged crops. County officials saw another problem waiting to be solved, and because everyone started with the same assumption, they all reached the same conclusion. Corinne asked a different question. Instead of asking how to remove the hogs, she wanted to understand why they looked different from every other population she'd spent years trapping along Georgia's coast. That single question led her to a forgotten conversation, then to an overlooked piece of land, and finally to a discovery that had been quietly waiting in the marsh for decades. When the shipping channel cut through the land in 1926, most people believed it had ruined those wetlands by separating them from the mainland. In reality, that same isolation became their greatest protection. While similar bloodlines across the southeast gradually disappeared through development and crossbreeding, this forgotten marsh quietly preserved something that might otherwise have been lost forever. The land itself had never been worthless. People had simply mistaken isolation for failure instead of recognizing it as preservation. Sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't found because someone is searching harder than everyone else. They're found because one person is willing to ask a different question and then stays long enough to listen for the answer. 2 years after buying 50 forgotten acres for $1, Corinne still begins many mornings the same way. She walks quietly to the edge of the marsh before sunrise and watches the reeds come alive as the first movement appears above the shallow water. The difference is that she no longer comes looking for proof. She comes to protect something people once believed had no value at all. The same land that made people laugh at the county courthouse became one of the region's most important heritage conservation sites, not because anyone planned for it, but because one person refused to stop asking questions after everyone else had already decided they knew the answer. Sometimes the greatest pieces of American history aren't hidden inside museums or buried beneath the ground. Sometimes they're still waiting in places everyone else stopped believing were worth looking at. If you enjoy stories about forgotten land, overlooked people, and the remarkable history they uncover, subscribe and come back for the next one. There are still plenty of forgotten places across America with stories waiting to be told.